You know exactly what it felt like. You'd hear a song on the radio, and your mom would quietly reach over and change the station. No explanation, just that look. Some of those songs were banned outright. Others just made adults deeply uncomfortable. And honestly, that only made them more unforgettable. These are the 13 forbidden 70s songs you weren't supposed to play as a kid. Number 13, Je t'aime, moi non plus, by Serge Gainsbourg and Jane Birkin. By the time this song reached American audiences, it had already been pulled from radio stations across Europe. Serge Gainsbourg originally recorded it with Brigitte Bardot in 1967, but Bardot asked him not to release it. She was married at the time, and word of the recording had already begun to leak in the French press. He shelved it, then re-recorded it in 1969 with his new partner, British actress Jane Birkin. The song is a slow, whispered duet built around unmistakably intimate sounds. There are no graphic lyrics to point to. It came entirely from the mood and the breathing. That was enough. The Vatican condemned it, publishing a formal denunciation in its official newspaper. The BBC banned it outright. In Italy, the distributor was actually prosecuted. In Spain, under Franco's regime, it was completely off the table. Several other European broadcasters restricted it to late-night hours only, treating it essentially as adult content in audio form. And yet it reached number 1 in the UK in 1969, making it the first banned single ever to top the British charts, and the first foreign language song to do so. The song had actually been pulled from distribution while it was climbing the charts, after Fontana Records withdrew it under pressure. Gainsbourg immediately found another label, Major Minor Records, to reissue it, and it went straight to number 1 anyway. People bought it precisely because they weren't supposed to have it. For a kid growing up in that era, stumbling across this song felt like accidentally walking into a room you clearly weren't meant to enter. The effect it produced wasn't scandalous so much as quietly grown up in a way that the radio almost never was. 12. Lola by the Kinks. The Kinks released Lola in 1970, and on the surface, it sounds like a cheerful, guitar-driven pop song. It tells the story of a young man who meets a woman named Lola at a club in London and gradually realizes she may not be a woman at all. Ray Davies has said it was based on a real incident involving the band's manager, who danced the night away in Paris with someone whose stubble only became visible the next morning in daylight. The BBC initially refused to play it, though not for the gender-bending storyline. The original version mentioned Coca-Cola by name, and the BBC had a strict policy against product placement in songs. Ray Davies flew back from a US tour specifically to re-record that one line, a roughly 6,000-mile round trip for a single lyric change. The BBC cleared it after that revision, and the song became a massive hit on both sides of the Atlantic, reaching number 2 in the UK and number 9 on the Billboard Hot 100. But the subject matter remained its own quiet controversy. For many parents in 1970, the idea of a song casually exploring cross-dressing and gender ambiguity on pop radio was deeply unsettling. The Kinks weren't being provocative for shock value. The song treated the whole situation with warmth and even humor, which somehow made it harder for adults to dismiss. It got played, it got heard, and plenty of households had conversations about it that no one was quite prepared to have. The Kinks were always a bit sharper than they appeared. Lola is one of the best examples of that, a song that slipped past the gatekeepers dressed up as a foot-tapping pop tune. Number 11, One Toke Over the Line by Brewer and Shipley. Released in 1971, One Toke Over the Line became a surprise hit, reaching number 10 on the Billboard Hot 100. The title alone tells you everything about why parents weren't thrilled to hear it coming from their teenager's bedroom. The song is a gentle, almost country-flavored folk tune. Mike Brewer and Tom Shipley later said the phrase came out of an ordinary evening at a coffee shop in Kansas City. Shipley said something like it, Brewer liked the rhythm of it, and the song wrote itself from there. The duo maintained it had a deeper spiritual meaning. Vice President Spiro Agnew did not see it that way. He publicly called the song blatant drug culture propaganda that threatens to sap our national strength, and pressured the FCC to add it to a list of songs radio stations were advised to screen. It was one of the more memorable collisions between the Nixon administration and the counterculture, and predictably, the controversy only sent record sales upward. Several radio stations refused to air it. Others played it anyway, perhaps not fully processing the title on first listen. A cover version was performed on The Lawrence Welk Show in early 1971 by the show's regular vocalists, Gail Farrell and Dick Dale, who delivered it as a cheerful number. Welk, at the conclusion of the performance, remarked without any apparent irony that viewers had just heard a modern spiritual. The moment became one of the more surreal footnotes in 70s television history, and a near-perfect symbol of the gap between two Americas that couldn't even agree on what a song was about. For kids at the time, the song carried a certain outlaw weight that only grew because the adults around them made such a fuss over it. Number 10, Walk on the Wild Side by Lou Reed.
Hitchhiked away across the USA.
Lou Reed released this in 1972, and it's remarkable that it got as much radio play as it did. The song is a series of character sketches drawn from the world of Andy Warhol's factory, transgender women, hustlers, and drag queens, each introduced with matter-of-fact clarity and without a trace of judgment. The BBC played it without initially catching a reference to oral sex buried in the lyrics. The phrase used was slang that wasn't widely recognized at the time by broadcasters, and by the time anyone looked closely enough to object, the song was already a hit. Pulling it would have drawn more attention than leaving it alone.
The Sugar Plum Fairy waiter came and hit the street.
American radio was similarly divided. Some stations played it freely, others quietly avoided it. The song reached number 16 on the Billboard Hot 100 in early 1973. For most parents who did understand what they were hearing, the characters themselves were the issue. Holly, Candy, Jackie, Joe. Reed introduced them the way you'd introduce old friends, as fully realized people rather than cautionary figures. In 1972, that casual acceptance of people living far outside the mainstream was its own kind of statement. The song didn't demand anything from the listener. It just told you about these people's lives and moved on. It was hiding in plain sight on AM radio, and most adults who caught the implications weren't quite sure what to do about a song that was simultaneously a hit and deeply transgressive. That ambiguity was exactly what made it so interesting to the teenagers who heard it.
Take a walk on the wild side.
Number 9, White Rabbit by Jefferson Airplane. White Rabbit was released in 1967, but it remained a constant presence on FM rock radio throughout the early 70s, and a consistent source of parental anxiety well into the decade. Jefferson Airplane's Grace Slick wrote it after noticing that Lewis Carroll's Alice in Wonderland was filled with characters offering Alice strange substances that altered her size and perception. Her point was that classic children's literature had been doing something very similar long before rock music arrived. The song builds slowly, drawing directly on Alice's journey through Wonderland, and building toward an unmistakable climax that most adults understood as a drug reference. The Federal Communications Commission sent warnings to radio stations in 1971. urging them to screen songs for drug-related content before airing them. White Rabbit appeared regularly on the lists that accompanied those warnings. It never received a formal nationwide ban, but individual stations dropped it during certain hours, particularly in morning programming when younger listeners might be tuning in. Parents who hadn't grown up with rock radio often had no framework for a song that seemed to hold two meanings simultaneously, one drawn from children's literature and another aimed squarely at the counterculture. Hearing it at the wrong moment, in the wrong household, could easily ignite an argument at the dinner table. It remained that kind of friction point for years after it was first recorded. Grace Slick performed it at Woodstock in 1969, and that association between the song and the festival generation only added to the suspicion surrounding it for parents who weren't part of that world. By the early 70s, it had become shorthand for a certain kind of cultural divide. You either heard a clever commentary on Victorian children's fiction, or you heard a drug song. Which side you landed on said a great deal about where you stood on everything else. Number 8, Killing Me Softly with His Song by Roberta Flack. This one requires a little context to explain why it made certain people uneasy, because on the surface, Killing Me Softly is a gorgeous, soulful ballad. Roberta Flack released it as a single in 1973, and it topped the Billboard Hot 100. At the 1974 Grammy Awards, it won 2 awards, Record of the Year and Best Female Pop Vocal Performance. The discomfort wasn't about drugs or sexuality. It was more subtle than that. The song describes a woman sitting in a club, listening to a stranger perform, and feeling utterly exposed, as if he were singing directly about her private life, her secrets, the pain she had kept carefully hidden. Every verse is an act of emotional undressing. For conservative listeners, there was something almost too naked about the song, too willing to put a woman's inner vulnerability at the center of a piece of popular music. The song was co-written by Norman Gimbel and Charles Fox, and Flack has said she first heard it on an airplane and was so struck by it that she wrote down the melody on scratch paper right there in her seat. That sense of being ambushed by music, of a song reaching you before you had any defenses up, is exactly what the lyrics are about. There was a kind of double resonance to it for anyone paying attention. It wasn't banned anywhere. No broadcaster pulled it. But in certain households, particularly those where emotional restraint was treated as a virtue and strong feelings were kept firmly private, this song made adults visibly uncomfortable. Children who loved it sometimes learned to play it quietly or to keep their feelings about it to themselves. The feeling of being truly seen, which the song captures so precisely, was something not every family had language for. Number 7, My Ding-a-Ling by Chuck Berry. Chuck Berry spent decades as one of rock and roll's founding figures before scoring his only number 1 hit on the Billboard Hot 100 in 1972 with what is, at face value, a novelty song about a bell on a string. My Ding-a-Ling was recorded live at a concert in Coventry, England. The crowd packed and enthusiastic throughout. The song is built entirely around double entendre. Every reference to the object in question can be taken literally or not, and Berry was well aware of both interpretations. The live recording makes that clear from the way the audience responds.
I'd sit there and play with my ding-a-ling.
Mary Whitehouse, the prominent British moral campaigner, attempted to have it banned by the BBC. The effort failed, and the song hit number 1 on both the US and UK charts. Parents who understood the joke didn't necessarily want their 8-year-old singing along with it on a long car ride. Those who didn't understand it would eventually figure it out, usually at an inopportune moment. There was something particularly awkward about this song compared to others on this list. It wasn't edgy or transgressive in any serious sense. It was just cheerfully, unambiguously smutty, and it was everywhere. Either way, it created long silences in a lot of family settings once someone caught on. Number 6, The Pill by Loretta Lynn. Loretta Lynn recorded The Pill in 1972, but her label, Decca Records, sat on it for 3 years before finally releasing it in 1975. The song is sung from the perspective of a woman who has finally gained access to oral contraception and is done being tied down by unwanted pregnancies while her husband lives as he pleases. More than 60 radio stations refuse to play it. In parts of the rural South especially, it was effectively unhearable on commercial radio. Country music in 1975 was not a genre where women spoke this plainly about reproductive freedom, and the resistance from radio programmers was both swift and widespread. Loretta Lynn was already a major star. Coal miner's daughter had made her one of the most respected names in country music. That made the refusals all the more pointed. The song still reached number 5 on the Billboard country chart, meaning enough stations played it to give it significant airplay. But the gap between the stations that embraced it and those that rejected it was a window into just how divided the country was on the subject at the time. In homes where birth control itself was considered an inappropriate topic, much less a subject for a hit song, this one was absolutely off the table for younger ears. Number 5, Love to Love You Baby by Donna Summer. Donna Summer's breakthrough came in 1975 with a song that spent most of its full album version, which ran over 16 minutes, in a state of barely concealed simulation. Producer Giorgio Moroder built the track around Summer's breathy, improvisational performance, recording her in near darkness, lying on the studio floor. The moaning was the entire point. The edited single ran just under 5 minutes, but even that version was banned by the BBC and pulled from rotation at numerous American radio stations. The BBC tracked the full album version and counted over 20 simulated moments of ecstasy by one tally. Reverend Jesse Jackson organized public opposition to it through his advocacy group, arguing that songs of this nature contributed to broader social harm among young people. Broadcaster after broadcaster in both the US and the UK refused to play it. None of that stopped it from reaching number 2 on the Billboard Hot 100 in early 1976, where it was held off the top spot only by Paul Simon's 50 Ways to Leave Your Lover. Summer herself later said she was uncomfortable with the persona the song created for her. She had a deeply religious background, and the character she played in the recording was not the person she was off stage. But there was no taking it back. It launched her career and helped define what disco could be at its most unapologetically physical. For kids, this was the song you heard at someone else's house, someone whose parents had different rules, and it stayed with you in a way that most other songs didn't. Number 4, Ride Captain Ride by Blues Image.
Rolled off of the ship, and here's what they had.
Released in 1970, Ride Captain Ride is a breezy, upbeat rock song that reached number 4 on the Billboard Hot 100. On first listen, it sounds like a joyful song about sailing or adventure. The references to 73 men on a ship heading somewhere new felt open-ended enough that most listeners didn't examine them too closely. The actual origin of the number 73 is far more ordinary than the rumors suggested. Songwriter Mike Pinera has said he looked at the Fender Rhodes piano sitting in front of him in the studio, noticed it had 73 keys, liked the rhythm of the number in the lyric, and built the opening line from there. That was it. But a rumor circulated in certain circles that 73 was a drug reference, tied to a specific bottle configuration that apparently had meaning in drug culture at the time. Blues Image never confirmed this interpretation, and the band members gave varying accounts over the years. Radio stations generally played the song without issue, but once parents caught wind of the theory, it joined a long mental list of songs to monitor. Whether the interpretation was accurate almost didn't matter by that point. The suspicion was enough. It's a good example of how the 70s worked. A song didn't have to be explicitly about anything for it to become forbidden in a particular household. A rumor was sufficient. The song sounded innocent. That, combined with the whisper of something else, was more than enough to put it on certain parents' radar. Number 3, Rated X by Loretta Lynn.
Well, if you've been a married woman.
Loretta Lynn appears on this list twice, which says something about how consistently she was willing to push past what country radio would tolerate. Rated X came out in 1972 and dealt with the social stigma that followed divorced women. The premise was direct and unflinching. A woman who has been through a divorce is treated as morally suspect, as if her failed marriage makes her dangerous to other people's relationships. Many country radio stations refused to play it on exactly those grounds. The subject of divorce was uncomfortable enough on its own. A woman singing about it with this much directness and with this much barely contained anger at the double standard was simply too much for significant portions of the format. It still reached number 1 on the Billboard country chart, carried there by the stations that did play it and by listeners who actively sought it out because of the controversy. Lynn didn't back down, and the song's chart success gave her more room to push further, which led, a few years later, to The Pill. The two songs together form a kind of pair, one about the shame that followed women who left bad marriages, and one about the freedom to have some control within them. Both were considered unplayable by a significant portion of her own genre. Both charted anyway. Number 2, Afternoon Delight by Starland Vocal Band.
Gonna find my baby, gonna hold her tight.
Afternoon Delight won the Grammy Award for Best New Artist in 1977, so it clearly wasn't banned or widely suppressed. It belongs on this list for a different reason, because of what happened in a lot of family living rooms once the lyrics were actually processed. The song was presented as bright, gentle, feel-good pop. Bill Danoff, who wrote it, has said, "The inspiration came from a happy hour menu at a restaurant in Georgetown, Washington, D.C. that listed items called Afternoon Delights." Most adults, and certainly most older teenagers, understood that the finished song was not about food. The extended metaphor was about sexual anticipation in the middle of the day, and it was constructed to sound entirely innocent while saying exactly what it meant. It reached number 1 on the Billboard Hot 100 in the summer of 1976, during bicentennial 4th of July week, in fact, with skyrockets in flight, providing an appropriate, if entirely accidental, tie-in to the holiday fireworks. Many parents found themselves in the uncomfortable position of being unable to object to a song that was, on its face, about daydreaming on a sunny afternoon. Some figured out the subtext quickly, others genuinely didn't. Kids who caught on before the adults in their household did had a particular quiet advantage. The private pleasure of knowing something that hadn't registered yet in the room. It's one of the most successful cases of a song saying everything while technically saying nothing at all. Number 1, I Am Woman by Helen Reddy.
I am woman.
Helen Reddy first recorded I Am Woman for her 1971 debut album, but the song found its audience slowly. A re-recorded version was released as a single in May 1972, and after months of grassroots momentum, women calling radio stations to request it, Reddy performing it on television show after television show, it finally reached #1 on the Billboard Hot 100 in December of that year. It earned her the Grammy Award for Best Female Pop Vocal Performance in 1973. In her acceptance speech, she famously thanked God because she makes everything possible. For many women, it was an empowering, joyful declaration of strength and self-determination. For others, it was precisely that quality which made it threatening. In households where traditional gender roles were firmly established, where the idea of women asserting equal standing was viewed as a challenge to family structure or religious values, this song was not welcome. Some parents changed the station the moment they recognized it. Some dismissed it openly. The cultural battle around it was real, and it played out not just in public, but at kitchen tables and in living rooms across the country. It was never banned. No broadcaster pulled it. But children caught in the middle of that tension learned quickly which side of it their household stood on. Hearing "I Am Woman" on the radio could shift the mood of an entire room depending on where you grew up. There's a particular kind of forbidden that has nothing to do with regulatory bans. It's the quieter, domestic version, where a song becomes off limits simply because it represents something the adults in charge weren't ready to accept. "I'm Woman" was that kind of forbidden for a lot of kids, and the fact that it was clearly joyful, clearly hopeful, only made the resistance to it more telling. The 70s had a soundtrack that nobody fully agreed on. Some of these songs were pulled from radio by broadcasters. Some were quietly swapped out by a parent's hand on the dial. Some were just understood, without anyone saying a word, to be the kind of thing you didn't bring up at the dinner table. What's striking, looking back, is how many of them were simply telling the truth about desire, about freedom, about the way real life actually worked for women, for people on the margins, for anyone who didn't quite fit the image of what mainstream radio was supposed to sound like. That was often the whole problem. If any of these took you back, or if there's a song from your own memory that belongs on this list, drop it in the comments. We'd genuinely love to hear it. And if you haven't already, hit that like button and subscribe. There are a lot more stories like these where this came from.